During the 19th century, Britain transformed from a largely rural economy into the world's most industrialised nation. We call that period the Industrial Revolution. There are various reasons why the Industrial Revolution was able to take place, and one of them was the ability to transport coal and other goods around the country by canal. In this video, we'll be looking at the Regent's Canal, which in the early 19th century linked the City of London and London's docks with the rest of the country. And it's still one of London's greatest assets. So sit back to watch, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the History of London channel if you haven't already done so. And I love hearing from you, so please leave a comment with your thoughts. Since the Middle Ages, perhaps even in Roman times, London was Britain's greatest manufacturing centre, with numerous workshops producing all kinds of items. Yet the Industrial Revolution relied heavily on coal to power steam engines and for the production of metal, so heavy industry largely took place not in London, but in the English Midlands and the north, closer to where the coal was mined. In the 18th century, roads were in poor condition, and railways had yet to be created. Mine owners in the northwest of England, such as the Duke of Bridgewater, realised the answer was to create canals to transport their coal from the mines to where it was needed. Barges could carry large loads of coal or other goods, slowly towed along by a horse that could pull 30 times more on water than on land. When the potter Josiah Wedgwood transported his products by wagon from his factory at Stoke-on-Trent, much of it arrived damaged. He therefore took an interest in creating a canal to carry his products to market. He commissioned the engineer James Brindley to create a waterway that linked two important rivers and thereby connect many important towns, from Liverpool to Hull. To optimise the amount barges could carry, Brindley was influenced by those already working in coal mines, and thus the standard size of canal boats thereafter became 7 feet wide by 72 feet long, what we call narrow boats. An extensive canal system was then created during the second half of the 18th century, linking many of the major English rivers and allowing passage by boat between all the industrial parts of the Midlands. But it wasn't until the creation of the Grand Junction Canal at the beginning of the 19th century that the canal system finally linked London to the industrial Midlands via the Oxford Canal. The new waterway started from a junction with the Oxford Canal at the village of Braunston, and you can still see signs along the canal, such as this one near West Drayton in West London, letting you know the distance to Braunston. The Grand Junction joined the Thames here at Brentford to the west of London. And a branch was then created from Hayes to a large basin at Paddington, which you see here from around that time. Paddington was then a village to the west of the city, and goods had to travel the last 3 or 4 miles into London by wagon. You can see from this picture that the area around Paddington was still quite rural. This expanse of water close to Paddington Basin is these days known as Browning's Pool, and the area more generally as Little Venice. This is Little Venice as it is now. The origin of the name Little Venice is disputed. It is often attributed, with little evidence, to the early 19th century poet Lord Byron, or the Victorian poet Robert Browning. In fact, the name didn't come into use until the 1950s, when it began to be used by newspapers, estate agents and the local council. It was at Little Venice that I joined Charlie Foreman. Charlie is a tour guide who leads walks along the Regent's Canal for the Inland Waterways Association and knows a lot about the canal and its history. We'll be walking eastwards from Little Venice as far as Islington. So let's listen to Charlie as he takes us back to the time that the Grand Junction Canal reached close to London and explains why the Regent's Canal came into existence.
So London now had a canal basin on its western edge. And just as the first barges were pulling in, work was beginning on a mass of different docks to the east of the city. It was a no-brainer to join the docks with the canal network. And that was an idea in the mind of a man called Thomas Homer, who owned quite a big fleet of barges. It was in his mind for a while before he got any traction on it, but he managed to get interest from an important mover and shaker, John Nash, the master planner who was laying out the West End of London as the Prince Regent wanted to see it. And Nash could see that with a great new West End, he needed a means of supplying it. And the canal seemed to answer that question. So the two of them, with others, began to formulate the idea of building the canal. It's 6 miles from Paddington to Limehouse as the crow flies. But London was exploding at that point and pushing northwards. So to get a canal between the two without cutting through the built-up space took 8.5 miles of waterway and a drop of nearly 30 metres, which involved building 12 locks. This is the start of the Regent's Canal, and the water in it is a precious commodity. It doesn't come naturally. When the canal opened, it was connecting with the Grand Junction Canal, taking boats all the way up to Birmingham. Two different companies, and the Grand Junction was not going to let the Regent's have its water. So when the Regent's completed its canal, the condition was they had to keep the level of water in their canal higher than in the Grand Junction, which is a way of ensuring that they're not going to nick the Grand Junction's water. To do that, there was something called a stop gate across the canal at its entrance, which kept the water level in the Regent's a tiny bit higher than it was on the other side.
The Regent's Canal Company had to find a source for its water, and various arrangements were put in place, none of which proved satisfactory. Finally, in the 1830s, the company purchased land at Hendon that allowed two streams to be dammed to form the Brent Reservoir. Water flowed from there to the Grand Junction Canal, which could then be provided to the Regent's Canal. To the east of the reservoir, standing beside the Edgware Road, was the Welsh Harp Inn. During the 1850s, the inn was acquired by the Regent's Canal Company, who rented it to William Warner. He developed it into a venue to where city folk could travel out by railway to enjoy the rural tranquillity of the reservoir. So popular did the location become that even today most people will know Brent Reservoir as the Welsh Harp. And the Welsh Harp remains a popular place for walking and sailboating. But let's go back to Little Venice, where Charlie will explain how the canal company made its money.
This is the toll house for the Regent's Canal, and it was where the users of the canal had to pay a fee for the cargo that they were carrying. The first section of the Regent's Canal is one of the most attractive, and that's in part because it has a road running down either side of it, a very unusual feature for a London canal. Behind the road you see these elegant villas overlooking the waterway, and this layout is probably because the landowners already recognised the value of this land as a potential new wealthy suburb of London. The canal's first tunnel is at Maida Hill. It's about 250 metres long, and you'll see from the pictures here that there is no towpath for the horses to pull the barges through. They were unharnessed and walked across the top. So how did you get boats through the tunnel? The picture here shows that it was quite a dramatic effort. One man on either side of the boat hanging over the edge and basically using their feet to leg the boat through. This was something that went on in the Maida Hill Tunnel until quite late in the 19th century. The next, shorter, Ayres Tunnel does have a towpath alongside. Up above, there is a house called the Upside Down House, which is where one of the managers from the nearby power station would be able to oversee the movement of barges coming in to deliver coal to give the power station its fuel. Horses were towing the barges using a rope. And what you've got here is a bit of metal sleeving protecting the brickwork on the side of this tunnel, quite common on the bridges on the Regent's Canal. And what you can see in the metal sleeving is this deep scoring, which was caused by the ropes that the horses were using. And you might be thinking, well, how can a rope cut through metal like that? And the reason is that the horses needed cinders underfoot laid on the towpath to get a good grip, and the ropes picked up the cinders and then became very abrasive, enabling them to cut through that metal. So you can imagine if there wasn't metal there, it would be slicing through the brickwork like butter. John Nash had the idea of cutting the canal right through the middle of his new Regent's Park, but the landowners, the Crown Commissioners, had other ideas. They thought that bargees coming through such an elegant space with very wealthy residents surrounding it wouldn't be welcome, and they told Nash to cut his canal to the north, and that was on the edge of Primrose Hill, which meant he had to dig out a lot more land in order to get the canal through. More expensive, more inconvenient. This is Macclesfield Bridge, and I'm going to take you back to just before dawn on the 2nd of October 1874. There's a flotilla of barges being tugged along the canal here, and as one of them, called the Tilbury, is underneath the bridge, there is an absolutely massive explosion. Bridge is blown to pieces. The 4 people on board are all killed. Some of the debris crashes through the roofs of nearby houses. The animals in the zoo go berserk. What's happened? That was a barge carrying gunpowder, and allegedly there was a man with a brazier on board the Tilbury, and clearly a spark got into the gunpowder. Why were they carrying that? Well, the canals really needed to take the goods which the railways were unhappy to carry, and of course gunpowder was one of the most unsafe things. Big inquiry after that, and the next year a whole set of legislation came into force, making it much safer to take explosives around the country. They had to get the bridge rebuilt and the canal reopened as fast as possible. And amazingly, these pillars survived the explosion and could be reused. And there is a little clue as to the fact that that happened, because on this side of the pillar you get the traditional marks of the ropes rubbing against the ironwork. But if you just go around to the other side, you can see the same marks here. And that's because originally, before the explosion, the pillar was turned the other way around, and when they replaced it, they put the plain side facing the canal. At this point, it looks as if the canal reaches a dead end. In fact, it jags sharply to the left, and originally you would have been able to continue straight on to a canal basin which was going to supply the Cumberland market, a concept John Nash had developed to sell hay. It also brought many of the other supplies which the West End needed. This is a horse slip, a ramp that goes down from the towpath to the bottom of the canal. And it was really to get horses that had been spooked and had stumbled and fallen into the canal back out again. It's quite a common feature on the Regent's Canal, quite rare elsewhere, but where I'm standing, I'm looking straight at the railway bridge which took the trains into Euston, and the sparks and steam and smoke could have been a cause for causing a horse to get alarmed. And if it fell in the water, it wasn't going to be easy to get it back on the towpath unless you had these ramps to lead them out.
Now we arrive at Camden Town and Camden Market, one of London's busiest tourist spots. From here at Camden Lock, the Regent's Canal gradually descends 42 metres, or 137 feet, down to the Thames at Limehouse over a distance of nearly 10 kilometres, or 6 miles. For those unfamiliar with canals, perhaps I should explain about locks. Canals are man-made waterways that need to be filled with water, usually from reservoirs. Unlike rivers, over a distance, a canal can pass up hills and down into valleys. Along its length, there will be locks, which are basically lifts or elevators that carry boats up or down from one level to another. For a boat to ascend or descend, gates must be closed at each end of the lock. Ratchets, known as paddles, are then raised at either the higher or lower gates to allow water to pass through sluices to either fill or empty the lock. Once the water in the lock has reached the level of either above or below the lock, the gates can be opened for the boat to pass out to the higher or lower level of canal.
Anticipating a busy canal, there were 2 locks at each point where the water level changed, allowing for boats to be moving in both directions at the same time. And here in the middle between them was a paddle which allowed an empty lock to be half filled by one that was full on the other side, saving water. Soon after the canal was finished, the railways arrived, and at this point at Camden there were enormous railway marshalling yards and goods yards, which gave the canal an opportunity to do a lot of extra work. And this rather marvellous building, which was put up quite a lot later, enabled transfer of goods between road, rail and water. Barges could be taken inside the building because there was a canal basin in the basement, and railway wagons could be shunted in from the opposite end, allowing direct transfer between rail and water. And on the side of the building was a great big apron and yard where horses and carts were waiting for deliveries which they could take round London's streets. In fact, the canal remained relevant right into the 20th century because it connected with these marshalling yards of 5 of London's main railway termini. Gilbey's gin, anybody? Gilbey's were present here for the best part of 100 years, distilling spirits, bottling them and keeping them in bonded warehouses. And some of the buildings that survive take their history back to that company. Here's another of those goods yards, this time at King's Cross. And where I'm walking used to be a canal basin. The building behind the granary building did what it says on the tin, stored grain. Coming in the other direction was coal, the thing that fueled London, and which was stored in these coal drops. The wagons came in at the high level, they shot the coal into hoppers, and from there the hoppers could supply carts which would take the coal around the streets. But boats could go in a tunnel underneath the building to load and unload grain, and then beyond that into railway sheds where there could be this transfer between rail and water. This is the Islington Tunnel, one of the most daunting engineering projects on the canal. You're faced with a hill more than 20 metres high, which has got springs in it, and has also got a canal cutting across it already. This is the New River, which was supplying London with some of its drinking water. What you can see from these pictures is that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and the only reason you can see that is because they got it dead straight. They did that by getting a line by eye on the top of the hill and then digging down shafts into the hillside, and they tunnelled out from each of those shafts, getting the line correct until each tunnel met the one next.
We'll continue our journey along the Regent's Canal, but it is here we say goodbye to Charlie. As we've already seen at Maida Hill, there is no towpath through the Islington Tunnel, so instead I'll take a boat and meet you on the other side. Of course, when the canal first opened, without a towpath through the tunnel, horses that towed the barges would have to walk over the top of Islington Hill and down here to the far side. The Islington Tunnel is quite long, and as you can imagine, it took a lengthy time to leg a boat through. It is also narrow and difficult for boats travelling in opposite directions to pass each other. So several years after the tunnel opened, the company began experimenting with various kinds of mechanism to tow boats through. They eventually settled on a steam-powered tug, such as the one you see in this photo. In August 1820, the official opening of the Regent's Canal took place with great ceremony. But what effect did the creation of the canal have? To find out, I met with East London historian Carolyn Clark, author of several books including East End Canal Towers, and we'll continue our journey along the Regent's Canal. In the description below, I'll give a link to Carolyn's website.
The Regent's Canal was of course an artery of commerce, and one of the primary reasons it was developed was for the coal trade, and coal in terms of many functions, but primarily at the time to feed the gasworks and a huge demand for coal. There were several gasworks along the East End stretch, and the one that still stands is at Bethnal Green, which had 4 gas holders, and the 2 that remains, the earliest one was 1865. The third largest gas holder in the world was at the Stepney Gasworks, which was built in the 1830s and had 5 gas holders. Coal was also needed to feed the huge steam engines that most of the industries at the time relied on. Timber was imported from all over the world to the banks of the East End canals, which were lined with numerous timber yards, sawmills and veneer factories. In fact, the veneer factories also even used the canal to soak the timber so that it could be sawn into thin strips. A description at the time said timber was piled high to the heavens in the shape of a chateau. And nearby industries relying on wood developed all along the canal as well, including, for example, the Bryanton Mays matchbox factory and also Mason Pearson's brushes.
It was intended from the start that the Regent's Canal would provide a link from England's industrial heartlands to the City of London via the Grand Junction Canal. It wasn't possible to take the canal directly into the city, but the Regent's Canal Company created a large dock just to its north. And the great expanse of water is mostly still there, which Carolyn will tell us about.
Well, this is now known as City Road Basin, but when it was built about the same time as the Regent's Canal, it was designed as an inland port, and it was called Regent's Canal Basin. And it was about a third longer than it is now, because the basin used to go under the city road to the other side, but that's been subsequently filled in. At the other end of the basin was where Pickford's was based, and they were a huge removal company that lived on for many years, but they started off in the canal trade, and they provided the boats, a fleet of boats that went up and down the canal, delivering, taking away. It's all part of the trade. In the corner over there was one of London's hydraulic power stations, which piped water power across London to places like the theatres to raise and lower the curtains. It was a really big enterprise, but it was also didn't only use the canal to deliver coal, but it also used the canal water as part of its operations and paid a fee to the Regent's Canal Company to do so. On the opposite corner we had a huge timber yard, which is the start, I think, of Esdale's timber yard. And it was piled all the way down the canal towards Shoreditch. After the timber yard stopped trading, the corner here was taken over by British drug houses, who were established from 1904, and they had a huge number of buildings, both this side of the basin, the other side of the basin, and at the top of Wenlock Basin. And British drug houses were famous for a lot of innovation, including they made the first synthetic vitamin D, and they also did a lot of work on contraceptive pills and insulin. Right, this is the D Speckers, or Die Speckers as some people call it, building, and it was from 1908. It was the base of a marble company that particularly specialised in terrazzo flooring, and that's the flooring that you see in many banks. Selfridges has got that flooring in London, and they employed about 250 staff, and that included mainly Italian workers, as they were the specialists in marble. Large sacks of marble chips were imported and brought down by canal boat to the other side of the building where there's a large wharf, and they were taken in and made into this beautiful, beautiful flooring.
So this is the Gutta Percha factory in Wharf Road by Wenlock Basin along the canal. Gutta Percha was a tree resin like rubber, imported by boat in great big blocks, And one of the many uses of it, besides golf balls and all manner of things, was to make the cable, and this is the transatlantic cable that connected, first of all, England to France in 1846. So 29 miles of copper cable coated with gutta percha, which was a waterproof gum, was produced here. The factory employed 400 people, and among them small boys who were paid to coat the golf balls with white lead paint with their hands.
So this is Henry Gristle's Regent's Canal Ironworks. It was built in 1814. It's one of the few original buildings at that age still left along the canal. So we're fighting to preserve it at the moment. It was a magnificent factory. It produced things for places like Buckingham Palace, Covent Garden, all over the country and abroad. Henry Gristle's ironworks can be seen. The ironworks were based on the canal for two very good reasons. One was the canal could deliver the huge amounts of coal that was needed for the foundry fires, and the other was that the water was used to cool down the ironworks. So water was sucked into the ironworks and then discharged back into the canal. And people of a certain age used to remember being sent down here to have a bath with a bar of Lifebuoy soap because the water was nice and warm. And there was even a rumour, I think it's a bit of gossip, that there were tropical fish in the canal. We're here at Kingsland Basin in front of one of the older buildings that remain. This was a stables block, and as you can see it's on three storeys, and there are ramps inside so that the horses could actually get up higher in the building. This was actually built for tram horses rather than canal horses, but it was also used by the local borough for the horses carrying its carts. And one of the reasons it's on the basin was that horses produced a substance, which was actually a very valuable substance, manure. And at one time this basin had 4 manure wharfs, which was then loaded onto boat and shipped out into the country. It's a circular trade because the manure went out of the fields, and then afterwards the hay and foods for animals came back on the boats. And on the other side of the basin, we've got what's called the forage warehouse, which was built mainly for hay and other goods for to feed the creatures. And you can see at the front where the hay would be unloaded and then hoisted up into the building. And that served a whole number of firms that were totally reliant on horses for transportation. So the forage warehouse in about the 1960s, 70s was converted into a spice warehouse where they imported spice, and it was filled into little jars, which are like the jars you see in the shops today. It's now flats. So Kingsland Basin was developed in 1827, and it was mainly a wharf for building materials. That was stone, cement, some of the metals, also bricks. They developed all the buildings both along the canal, all the industries, as well as the housing that came with them, housing the workers to work in the industries. In particular, in about 1890 in Kingsland Basin, as well as 4 manure wharfs, there are also 12 builders' wharfs. And that included ones that lasted quite a long time into about 1980s, 1990s. In the 1980s, where the stable block is now, that was the headquarters of Pioneer Concrete, and they had huge concrete hoppers along here, and all the concrete that built the NatWest Tower in the city came from this very basin.
Just 3 years after the Regent's Canal opened, the company was approached by Sir George Duckett, owner of the Storks Navigation in Hertfordshire. His plan was to cut a short canal from here on the River Lee, at what is now within sight of the 2012 Olympic Stadium, through what was then countryside, to meet up with the Regent's Canal. Duckett's hope was to provide a canal through route between the Stort and the Midlands via the Lee, the Regent's Canal and the Grand Junction Canal. Duckett's Hertford Union Canal joined the Regent's at this junction. Unfortunately for Duckett, there wasn't enough trade to make the scheme successful though. He was declared bankrupt in 1832 and the Hertford Union was eventually taken over by the Regent's Canal Company. But many still know the short canal as Duckett's Cut. Over time, like the Regent's Canal, the banks of the Hertford Union were lined with industry.
Chemical industries vied with the timber trade for space along the Hertford Union Canal. There were byproducts from both coal and gas that made dyes, paints, drugs, explosives even, as well as disinfectant, fertiliser and drugs many will have heard of such as iodine and ammonia. Among the companies was the Imperial Chemical Colour Works, and another one was Carlis and Capel, which coined the phrase petrol. But there are also many noxious industries, including glues, paints, inks, all along the canal. At the junction of the Regent's and Hertford Union canals, the historic Bow Wharf stands, and over the years it's housed a paving stone wharf, Dalton's pipe factory, Victoria Veneers, Nichols and Clark's paint, and a glue factory.
After curving around to the north of London, the Regent's Canal met the Thames at Limehouse. There, a basin was created with a tidal lock so that seagoing ships could enter from the river to discharge directly onto canal barges. Many types of goods arrived at the Regent's Canal dock, but particularly coal brought from collier ships around the coast from Newcastle, as well as ice from Norway. Another speciality was scrap iron.
There are scrap yards all along the canal, and one of the largest traders in old iron was Cohen's. And this shows just outside his warehouse on the Regent's Canal dock. There was a contemporary report at the time that described the scene. Under sheds are the maddest medley of old iron ever seen, all that can be brought all over London by perambulating old rag and bone men. In fact, Cohen was one of the last people to use the dock, shipping 15 tonnes of scrap metal a year, and that was in the 1980s. From the earliest days, the canal companies employed lockkeepers who also used to take tolls, and they also had the blacksmiths with forges along the canal. In the early days, narrowboat families plied their trade between the Midlands and London, where the whole family lived in a tiny, tiny cabin, often with several children. The drivers took the horses and later the tractors from about 1950s, and the steerers were on the boat. The boats themselves increased from 30 tonnes originally with a narrow boat, which would carry 30 tonnes, but by the turn of the century they were actually up to 110 tonnes. The skill that was needed to turn the boats, often loaded with huge amounts of timber or whatever, into small openings of basins and wharves, was enormous, and so the men were actually very good at what they did, and the drivers got very fond of their horses. The drivers used to carry a whip, but this was never for the horses. It was actually to signal under the tunnels so that if there was someone coming the other way, they'd know you were coming.
A good place to learn more about the Regent's Canal is the wonderful London Canal Museum, housed in a Victorian warehouse near King's Cross. I went there to meet with the museum's Tim Lewis.
We're here at the London Canal Museum, which is situated on Battlebridge Basin, which is off the Regent's Canal. Battlebridge Basin was built in 1820 and over the years has contained many industries around it, from beer bottling to jam making to timber yards to mills. The Canal Museum Trust was formed in the late 1970s and by 1992 had acquired this building. In the museum we have displays on the general history of canals and more specifically the canals within the London area. In addition, we have displays showing the types of boats that use the canal and the forms of pulling them, as in horses and towpath tractors. We also have half of a full-size boat which people can visit inside. The museum has a trip boat. We give walks along the canals, we have demonstrations and talks. The building was built for the ice trade and was used as such up until before the First World War. After that it was used for a variety of purposes, as a transport depot when stables were built upstairs, and after that for light industrial.
But enter the museum and you'll very quickly notice a big hole in the floor down to a large round space below the building. Let's go there to learn more.
Before the days of mechanical refrigeration, ice was generally taken from ponds and stored in small ice houses, but as the demand got bigger, we imported ice from the lakes of Norway, and which was stored in these massive ice wells. The ice wells here, of which we have two, stored up to 2,000 tonnes in wells that are 43 feet deep. This carried on until just before the First World War, when mechanical ice making was invented and the trade died off and the ice wells were filled in. The ice was imported from Norway on wooden sailing ships which came into the docks at Limehouse. It was then transferred to barges and brought up the Regent's Canal to a number of ice houses along the Regent's Canal, of which this was one. There is also another one by Camden Lock. The ice wells here were constructed in the mid-19th century by a man called Carlo Gatti, who was an immigrant from Switzerland. Carlo Gatti was a real entrepreneur. Not only did he have the ice businesses, he had music halls and cafes.
From the mid-19th century, railways progressively took trade away from the canal system, particularly from the Grand Junction Canal. Yet even during the first half of the 20th century, trade continued to be brisk on the Regent's Canal, with boats carrying coal to the various power stations, timber to canal side yards, and other goods to and from the many factories. So in the 1920s, a merger was agreed between the Regent's Canal Company and the Grand Junction Company. These days, the canal network is managed by the Canal and River Trust. I met at St Pancras Lock with Phil Emery, Heritage Advisor for the Canal and River Trust South East region, and he takes up the story from there.
So in 1929, the Grand Union Canal Company was formed. This was effectively an amalgamation of the Regent's Canal Company and the Grand Junction Canal Company. So in the years before the Second World War, there was a concerted effort to develop freight on the canals, linking the Port of London with the Midlands. So after the war, with nationalisation, British Waterways was formed. So all of the infrastructure and assets of the Grand Union Canal Company, including the Regent's Canal itself, came under the auspices of the British Waterways. And in the post-war period, we see the continuation of freight right the way up to the 1960s. But in parallel with that, there's also the emergence of recreational use of the waterway. As part of the transition from the commercial industrial use of the Regent's Canal to recreation, St Pancras Basin, an old coal basin, was converted to use as a yacht basin. Initially, the craft that berthed here were little cabin cruisers, but now you can see that almost all of the boats are narrowboats, which reflects the changing patterns of boat use on the Regent's Canal over several decades. So historically, the canal was an enclosed environment, closed off to the public and secure for the purpose of freight transport. But in the post-war period, there were gradual moves to open up the towpath, and by 1982 all of the London boroughs along the route of the Regent's Canal had opened up their respective sections of towpath. So with the opening up of the towpath all the way down to the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, there was a celebration at Mile End in May 1982, the Canalway Festival. So in the early days, the time when boaters could use the Regent's Canal was actually quite restricted. Lockkeepers had to be in attendance. So with growing interest for leisure boating on the Regent's Canal, British Waterways in 1973 had a scheme to convert one of the chambers on each of the locks to a weir. This meant that boaters could use the locks without the lockkeepers being in attendance. So behind me is St Pancras Lock. This is different to all the other 11 locks on the Regents because rather than the offside chamber being converted to a weir, here at St Pancras it's the towpath side. So one important aspect of public use of the Regent's Canal was the opportunity to go on trip boats. British Waterways had its own fleet of trip boats, many of them running from Little Venice. And in 1959, the water bus was inaugurated, which ran trips from Little Venice down to London Zoo. Many people will remember how run down King's Cross was in the 1950s and 1960s. And it wasn't until the 1980s when the first wave of regeneration took place. And really the first major improvement on the canal side was the creation of Camley Street Natural Park in 1985. So in 2012, the responsibilities of British Waterways were taken over by the newly formed Canal and River Trust, a charity set up with a constitution, articles of association and charitable objects. The Canal and River Trust looks after some 2,000 miles of inland waterways, including canals and river navigations, and it cares for over 10,000 structures, waterway structures such as locks and bridges, tunnels, aqueducts, weirs, reservoirs, and so on. And at the same time, the Trust is a charity relying on the generosity of members of the public, on partner groups and local communities, and also central government to enable the important charitable work that it carries out, looking after the inland waterways. Some 9 million people live within a 10 to 15 minute walk of the canals looked after by the Trust. And in London, some 1.5 million. With the inherent geography of this post-industrial transport network that the Trust looks after, with waterways reaching deep into the heart of former industrial towns, the Trust is actually very well placed to reach out to some of the most deprived communities that live close to the inland waterways, allowing people to benefit from all the recreational opportunities of the waterways.
Today, the only commercial traffic on the Regent's Canal is to service the moored boats. The gasworks and factories have long gone. They have been replaced by parks and residential estates. Overall, the canal is a much cleaner and more pleasant environment these days, but unfortunately, many characterful buildings have also been lost along the way. A group that keeps a watchful eye on developments is the Friends of Regent's Canal. Ian Shacklock can summarise what they do, and I'll put a link to their website in the comments below.
We're a pressure group that aims to promote and protect the Regent's Canal. We do this by facilitating projects and campaigns and events, and we disseminate information across our networks. On the subject of information, one of our main projects over the last 2 years was the refurbishment of the Regent's Canal Information Centre in Camden. We're involved in putting a lot of displays on the walls, massive map of the canal, supplemented with itemising all the bridges and their history and their dimensions. It's a mine of information if you're interested in that sort of thing. We're forever having to go through very major developments. A lot of them have a huge impact on the canal. We work with communities, we work with councils, we sort of we are like a focal point of that, and we use our website to share the information and to bring people forward. In the new year, one of our main projects will be the Barnsbury Estate redevelopment. That's happening right on the site of the west portal of the Islington Tunnel. This would deliver an 18-storey tower block which would completely transform this area. At the moment it's covered in trees on both sides. It will be unrecognisable.
An annual event is the Angel Canal Festival, each September at City Road Lock at Islington. I went along with my grandchildren, and it was there that I met festival organiser Sasha Keir.
Apart from the festival, my connection with the Regent's Canal is through St Pancras Cruising Club, where I've had a boat for the last 40 plus years. And I used to go along to the Angel Festival purely as a sort of canal visitor and then subsequently as a volunteer. The Angel Canal Festival really started with a garden party held by Crystal Hale in the back garden of our house that backed onto the canal in Noel Road in Islington. And she had been alerted to the fact that the City Road Basin was under threat of being developed and was up in arms about this, and gathered together a group of like-minded people. And the party was originally a fundraiser for that campaign, and then as it developed and became more of a regular party with events and musicians and things, she contributed the funding that was gathered to the Angel Community Canal Boat Trust and the beginnings of what became Islington Boat Club. And I got involved in 1996. Crystal had died, and her partner running the festival, Jim Lagden, was struggling to get the event done on his own. So our vice president at St Pancras Cruising Club, Roger Squires, thought Jim needs a couple of diplomats to help him, who would be oil the wheels, so to speak. So he enlisted Beryl Windsor and myself to give Jim a hand, and we eventually started running it pretty much ourselves. The Canal Festival itself funds a whole load of things on the day, including and particularly the activities of Angel Community Canal Boat Trust and the Islington Boat Club. So from the funding that I draw down, I give them a budget each to mount activities to outreach to the public, get in touch with local residents, get more kids involved with the boat club, and generally to publicise their activities as joint charitable bodies.